The ballroom at the Meridian Hotel shimmered with opulence. Gold-trimmed chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors so polished they mirrored the guests' every move. Crystal glasses chimed softly in the background, while a string quartet played a delicate arrangement of Clair de Lune. Every detail had been planned to perfection. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a spectacle, the social event of the season in Savannah, Georgia. Guests in tailored tuxedos and hand-sewn gowns whispered about the bride's new husband, a media consultant from Boston who had recently landed a multi-million-dollar political campaign. But while everyone else buzzed about the future, one man stood entirely still, almost hauntingly so. Elias Rohn, the bride's ex-husband, leaned against a pillar near the back of the room. His navy suit was sharp and understated, his posture calm, yet there was a tension about him, like a taut wire waiting to snap. No one dared approach him. Some guests stole glances, curious or uncomfortable. Others pretended he wasn't there. To most, he was a ghost from Lara's past, the man she'd survived to become who she was now. A powerhouse entrepreneur with 4.7 million followers, a best-selling memoir, and now a lavish wedding to crown it all. But no one really knew Elias. Not anymore. The ceremony began exactly at 5:30. The groom took his place at the altar beneath a canopy of orchids and white silk. Then came Lara, radiant in a champagne-colored dress that shimmered like it had been stitched from starlight. Her walk was slow, deliberate, her chin held just slightly higher than necessary. She was aware of every camera, every eye. Vows were exchanged, sweet, safe, and scripted. The crowd smiled, applauded lightly. Then came the moment when the officiant, a popular lifestyle influencer who had recently become an ordained minister for fun, paused dramatically and asked, "If anyone here objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." It was meant to be rhetorical. That was when Lara laughed, softly at first, then louder. The room turned toward her. Even the violinist stopped mid-note. The groom glanced at her, confused, as she turned to the crowd and raised her glass of champagne, perfectly timed and perfectly staged. "I know we're supposed to just move forward," she said, her voice carrying across the room without a microphone. "But I think Elias deserves a toast." There was a stunned silence. Someone dropped a fork. Elias didn't move. Lara's smile was wide and glossy, but her eyes held a sharpness that made the air colder. "To my ex-husband, Elias Rohn, who finally, after years of hiding, came out of the closet. It's brave, really. I mean that." There was a pause. Murmurs rose like a low tide. Someone in the back gasped. A few chuckled nervously, unsure of whether this was a joke, some kind of edgy performance piece, or an actual accusation. The groom shifted uncomfortably. A camera flash went off. A bridesmaid looked away. Still, Elias remained quiet, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Then a man stepped up beside him. No one had noticed him before. He was tall, dressed in a simple black suit, no tie. His presence was striking not because of extravagance, but because of the calm control he carried. He leaned close to Elias, and though no one could hear him, his lips moved with the clarity of someone who didn't need volume to be understood. "It's time. You ready?" Elias nodded. The man placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and together they turned and exited the ballroom without a word. No confrontation, no drama. Just that quiet, powerful decision to leave. As the double doors shut behind them, it was as if the air itself shifted. The guests buzzed with confusion and speculation, but deep down, many of them felt something else too. Something strange and unshakable. That maybe they had just witnessed the beginning of a story, not the end of one. Outside, beneath the orange-purple sky of a southern spring sunset, Elias stepped into a black car. The driver closed the door behind him. The man in the black suit was already inside, typing something on his phone. Elias exhaled slowly, almost like he'd been underwater and had finally surfaced. "You didn't flinch," the man said, looking at him for the first time. "I've been through worse," Elias replied. The car pulled away from the hotel, leaving behind laughter, whispers, and one bride still holding a glass of champagne. And that was the last anyone from that wedding saw of Elias Rohn for a very long time. The car moved smoothly through the outskirts of Savannah, its windows tinted dark enough to shield the two men inside from the rest of the world. Elias sat quietly, staring ahead at nothing. his fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the leather seat beneath him. The silence inside the vehicle wasn't awkward. It was purposeful. The man sitting across from him, the one who had so calmly ushered him out of the wedding, glanced up from his phone only once, just long enough to make sure Elias was still breathing. He was. Barely. It was nearly midnight when they arrived at the private airstrip. The jet was already waiting, engines quiet, cabin lights on, the stairs down like a discreet invitation. Elias hesitated only once at the bottom of the steps, his mind flashing back to the ballroom, the laughter, the cameras, and the weight of all those eyes. It was strange how humiliation didn't come with sound. He expected it to echo in his ears, but instead all he could remember was the way Lara's voice cut through everything. She didn't say it with rage. She said it with calculation. That was what made it hurt. They boarded the jet in silence, and within 10 minutes they were airborne, flying north toward New York. Once the seatbelt signs turned off, Elias finally spoke. "What happens now?" His voice was low, flat, not uncertain but worn. The man turned toward him. He had striking eyes, gray with a hint of blue, cool but not unkind. "Now you disappear. For a little while." Elias didn't respond. The hum of the engines filled the space between them. "My name's Curtis Verne," the man continued, as if they were meeting in a hotel lounge rather than flying away from the collapse of Elias's public life. "I'm the founder and CEO of Indigo Tower. I've been watching your story for a while. I didn't expect it to explode quite so publicly, but there it is." "You've been watching me?" Elias asked, his tone still not surprised, just hollow. "Your name started popping up in professional spaces. Design, strategy, architecture. Quiet genius type. People with talent that's strong tend to have something to hide." "I wasn't hiding," Elias muttered, then added after a beat, "I just wasn't ready." Curtis studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly like a man who'd heard that answer many times. "Before. That's fair. But you are now, and I think you know it." The jet soared over the Carolinas as Curtis opened a slim black folder and slid it across the table between them. Elias opened it and scanned the first few pages. It was a campaign pitch, a bold, visually raw concept for a global initiative under Indigo Tower's banner. The title at the top read, "The Unveiled Series," a new fashion meets identity project that sought to feature people who had shed their previous lives and stepped into their truth. Visibly, powerfully, unfiltered. "Why me?" Elias asked, not looking up. Curtis leaned back. "Because you didn't react. Not in that ballroom. Not when she said what she did. You didn't fight for approval or apologize for being. You didn't play into the spectacle. That kind of composure? That's something people recognize, even if they don't know what to call it." Elias closed the folder. "This isn't revenge, is it?" "No," Curtis said immediately, his voice firmer now. "This is reclamation." The plane landed at a private terminal just outside Manhattan. A driver met them on the tarmac and whisked them away in a sleek black SUV that cut through the quiet city like a blade. It was almost 3 a.m. when they arrived at the Indigo Tower headquarters, a towering glass and steel structure nestled in Tribeca, its top floors dimly lit but alive with movement. Elias followed Curtis up in a private elevator to the 36th floor, where the real work happened. Not the PR-friendly showrooms below, but the creative war room, the place where the future was designed, pixel by pixel, emotion by emotion. Curtis handed Elias a keycard. "You'll stay in one of the residential suites upstairs. No press, no digital footprint, no noise. You're off-grid until you decide who you're going to be next." Elias took the card, but didn't move toward the suite yet. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the city, its streets almost empty, its lights refusing to sleep. For the first time in years, he felt like a blank page. Not erased, just unwritten. He didn't have a brand anymore. He didn't have a title. He didn't have a mask. Curtis stood a few steps behind him. "You're not broken, Elias. You're just unedited." Elias finally turned to face him. "What do I have to do?" Curtis gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Just tell the truth. Loud enough for the world to hear it." Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out the window one more time. Below him, the city waited, and above him, for the first time, there was nothing to hide behind. Elias woke up to the unfamiliar quiet of the 38th floor. The suite Curtis had arranged for him wasn't extravagant in the usual way. There was no gold trim or pretentious artwork, but everything in it was deliberate. The walls were matte charcoal, the furniture Scandinavian minimalist, the sheets crisp and white with a faint scent of lavender. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the far side of the room, giving him an unobstructed view of lower Manhattan as the city began to stir. He stood for a long time watching the light change, watching people too small to see clearly begin to move, watching taxis creep along the avenues like pieces in a game. No one ever truly wins. This place wasn't home, but it was something new, and he didn't yet know if that was comfort or danger. Later that morning, Curtis texted him a single word: studio. Elias made his way down, using the key card to access a private elevator that opened into what felt more like an artist's warehouse than a corporate office. There were whiteboards scrawled with half-erased notes, fabric samples pinned to giant cork walls, mannequins wearing prototypes of clothing lines not yet revealed to the public. At the center of it all, Curtis stood barefoot on a concrete floor, talking with two designers while holding a tablet. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves rolled, and his hair looked like it hadn't seen a comb in hours. But he carried himself with the ease of someone who lived in this chaos rather than visited it. He looked up as Elias entered. "You sleep?" he asked casually. "Barely," Elias replied. "Too quiet." Curtis gestured to the team around him. "This is Rain and Mateo. They're concept architects for Indigo's identity division. You'll be working with them." Rain, a non-binary designer with silver-streaked hair and a gauzy black tunic, nodded in greeting while Mateo gave Elias a warm, slightly crooked smile and a firm handshake. There was an instant ease to them, not the false friendliness of people trying too hard, but the kind of calm presence that came from having lived through their own versions of unraveling and surviving. Curtis walked Elias toward a mood board pinned with dozens of faces, cut-out headlines, and handwritten notes. He pointed to the center, where there was an empty black square. "That's you," he said. "The campaign is called The Unveiled. We're building stories around individuals who've stepped out of hiding, whatever the reason. It's not just about being queer or trans or formerly closeted. It's about shedding a skin. Yours starts here." Elias studied the board. There were images of a former priest who now ran a queer art gallery in Prague, a model who transitioned in her 40s and walked Milan Fashion Week 2 months later, a man who had once led a conversion therapy center and now worked to dismantle the very system he helped build. The stories weren't curated for drama. They pulsed with something deeper, truth without apology. Curtis handed Elias a sketchpad. "I want you to build your piece. Visual, emotional, narrative, whatever form it takes. I don't care if it's a wall of color or a 3-act play. Just don't lie to yourself." That first day passed slowly, and Elias barely spoke. He observed, listened, scribbled half-thoughts in the margins of the sketchpad. He didn't know how to translate a life of silence into art. He only knew how to hide well. But there was something about being around people who had already done what he feared, people who wore their identities like armor instead of secrets, that made him restless in his own skin. Over the next week, Elias settled into a routine. Mornings started in the rooftop gym with Rain, who wordlessly handed him a bottle of water and forced him into motion. Afternoons were spent in the studio with Mateo, who had a gift for drawing stories out of people without them realizing it. At night, Elias wandered the creative levels alone, sometimes stopping to stare at a particular piece of art, other times just sitting in the cafe, watching the rain smear the city lights against the glass. He hadn't touched social media. His phone remained in a drawer. He knew Lara's outburst had gone viral. He knew clips from the wedding had made it to TMZ and Reddit, and probably a few cruel podcasts. But Indigo Tower had absorbed the blow for him. Curtis had shielded him. No leaks. No interviews. No public rebuttals. Not yet. One night, Elias found Curtis alone on the rooftop terrace, overlooking the skyline. He was smoking something hand-rolled and drinking black coffee out of a chipped ceramic mug. He didn't speak as Elias approached, only tilted his head in silent invitation. Elias sat beside him on a cold steel bench. "You always work this late?" Curtis exhaled smoke slowly. "I don't sleep well when things matter." They sat for a few minutes in quiet. "Why are you helping me?" Elias asked finally. "You didn't know me. You could have let me burn." Curtis turned to face him. "You think I didn't know what it's like to be dressed in the wrong life? To be applauded for things that choke you in private? I've been you. Maybe not in that ballroom, but close enough. I help people when I see myself in them. Call it selfish if you want. I don't, Elias said. And he meant it. Curtis's voice softened. I watched the footage. Everyone laughed, and you didn't flinch. That kind of restraint, that's not weakness. That's discipline. That's survival. And it's power when you learn how to use it. Elias looked out over the city. The light seemed endless, like a million opportunities waiting to be taken or lost. He had no idea what came next. He didn't know if the world would forgive him or if he even wanted it to. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something not rooted in fear. Maybe it was purpose. Maybe it was something simpler. Maybe it was the beginning of belief. News of the unveiled campaign spread faster than anyone at Indigo Tower had predicted. It began with whispers in the creative community. A few leaked concept shots, a cryptic teaser posted by one of the stylists, a tweet from a junior editor at Paper Magazine that simply read, "Whatever Indigo Tower is cooking with Elias Rohn, it's going to hurt feelings in a good way." Then came the inevitable spark that turned whispers into wildfire, an anonymous leak of Elias's photo board. Someone had snapped a picture of his workspace during a closed creative session, messy lines of ink and charcoal, personal notes in the margins, fragments of journal entries, childhood memories scribbled out, then rewritten with defiance. It wasn't polished, it wasn't curated. It was raw and breathtaking in a way that no marketing strategy could manufacture. People didn't know exactly what the campaign was about yet, but they knew it was real. Curtis wasn't surprised. He had expected the leak. In fact, he suspected it was intentional. Probably from Mateo or Rain, who both understood that certain fires only caught if you gave the wind a reason. What he hadn't expected was what happened next. Lara returned. It began subtly. First, she posted a carousel of glamorous black and white shots with a caption that read, "Truth is trendy. Some of us lived it before it had a hashtag." Then came the podcast circuit. Interviews where she casually mentioned her ex-husband's staged epiphany, questioning whether authenticity could still exist in a world obsessed with aesthetics. She never named Elias directly. She didn't have to. The algorithms connected the dots for everyone. By the end of the week, she had signed a contract with Rival Arc, Indigo Tower's most aggressive competitor. The company's founder, known for his provocative branding and disregard for ethics, launched a new initiative called Trueform, aimed at exposing performative identity marketing. Lara was to be the face of the movement. The campaign's slogan, "Real doesn't need rebranding." Curtis saw the press release while walking through the Indigo Lounge with Elias beside him. They both stopped when they reached the screen mounted on the wall. There she was, Lara, poised in a minimalist photoshoot, wearing a perfectly unflawed expression. Her eyes stared straight into the camera, as if she were daring the world to believe her. "She moves fast," Elias muttered. "She always did," Curtis replied. "But don't be distracted. This is just noise. She's not the story. You are." But Elias couldn't pretend it didn't hit something inside him. It wasn't the rivalry that got to him. It was the familiarity of her tactics. He had seen her do this before, reframe a narrative, steal the oxygen from the room, and make herself the protagonist in someone else's arc. She had a talent for recentering herself in any space, especially if she sensed power shifting toward someone else. This wasn't just business, it was personal. That night, Elias sat alone in his suite, scrolling through an old drive filled with archived files from his previous life. There were photos from their wedding, interviews they'd done as a couple for business magazines, even a saved draft of the TED Talk she had written but never gave, in which she called him her greatest collaborator and her most beautiful mistake. He had been the quiet engine behind her brand, sculpting her identity, editing her words, designing the spaces she stood in. Now she was using that history to paint him as a fraud. The next morning, he didn't go to the studio. Instead, he went straight to Curtis's office. The CEO was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by mock-ups for upcoming campaigns, drinking cold matcha from a glass jar. "I want to speak," Elias said, standing in the doorway, hands clenched at his sides. "Not just be part of the visuals. I want to speak, on record, in my voice." Curtis looked up and nodded slowly. "We've been waiting for you to say that." The media team arranged the shoot within 48 hours. No scripted questions. No styling team, just a camera, a mic, and Elias in a concrete room with soft white light flooding in through tall windows. The interviewer was someone Curtis trusted, a quiet, sharp journalist named Delaney with a reputation for cutting through nonsense and making people feel heard. Elias sat across from her, the collar of his linen shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair unstyled. There were no rehearsals. When the interview began, Delaney simply said, "Tell me about the moment you knew you had to stop hiding." Elias hesitated, only for a breath, then answered. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes without stopping. He talked about the years of silent agreements in his marriage, the way success made it easier to suppress parts of himself, the shame that lingered even in private moments of truth. He described how Lara hadn't outed him, not really, how the truth had already been standing in the room long before she opened her mouth at the wedding. He admitted to complicity, to the lies he told himself, to the roles he played because they were easier than disappointing people. But then he said something that cracked open the entire room. "I didn't come out because I became brave," he said. "I came out because I was finally too tired to keep pretending I wasn't suffocating." The silence afterward was profound. Delaney said nothing. The cameras kept rolling. Elias looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers once, then looked back up. "I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm just here to be real. If that helps someone else survive a little longer, then I'm glad. But I'm not performing anymore. I already did that for most of my life. This is the first time I'm actually awake." The video was released under the name The Interview No One Expected. Within 6 hours, it had 1 million views. Within 2 days, 10 million. Major outlets picked it up. Celebrities retweeted it with quotes that made headlines. Activists called it one of the most honest public statements of the year. A senator from Vermont posted a reaction video in tears, saying she had never seen a man speak so openly about the cost of conformity. And Lara? She responded with silence. At first, then came a tweet, carefully worded, razor sharp in its implications. "Everyone's brave when there's applause. Try being honest when no one's clapping." It was designed to wound, to call into question not the facts but the timing, to seed doubt. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The world had already chosen to listen, and for the first time the silence belonged to her. In the weeks following the release of the interview, Elias found himself at the center of a cultural moment he hadn't planned and barely understood. He had lived most of his adult life in the background, operating from behind other people's voices and visions. Now suddenly he was the subject. His face was on magazine covers. People quoted his words on Instagram stories like scripture. Artists began sketching his image, painting over his words, turning fragments of his pain into something they could wear, post, remix. At first it was disorienting. Every message that poured in, from old acquaintances, strangers, students, pastors, drag performers, even soldiers, felt like another weight dropped onto a growing pile of responsibility he hadn't asked for. But over time, the weight became something else. It became real, grounding, like evidence that his words hadn't just echoed into a void. They had found people. One message stood out. It was from a 16-year-old named Micah in rural Alabama. The email was written in lowercase letters, the sentences short and unsure, like someone who had never been asked how they felt before. Micah wrote that they had been planning to take their own life on the day Elias's interview came out. They had a note written, their phone powered off, their bedroom door locked. But as they were walking home from school, they had seen someone on a bus stop bench watching Elias speak on a phone, with subtitles showing his words. Micah had stopped and watched without hearing the sound, just watching Elias's face, his eyes, the way he didn't look like he was trying to convince anyone, just survive. Micah went home, turned their phone back on, searched for the video, and cried through the entire thing. At the end of the message they wrote, "I'm still here because I saw someone look like me," and he wasn't ashamed. Elias didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to. Nothing in his life had prepared him to be someone's reason for staying alive. He read the email over and over, letting the words settle into his chest like rain soaking through the thickest skin. Eventually he wrote back. It wasn't poetic or composed. He just wrote the truth. "I'm glad you stayed. I'm still learning how to stay too." That was all. But it was enough. Curtis noticed the change in Elias long before Elias did. He saw it in the way Elias carried himself, a little less guarded, a little more open. He no longer sat alone in the cafe upstairs, but joined the team during morning briefings. He laughed more. He challenged ideas. He offered suggestions not from the back row, but from the center of the room. The creative team at Indigo Tower didn't treat him like a celebrity or a client. They treated him like a co-conspirator, a builder, a collaborator. And Elias responded with the kind of sharp, instinctual clarity Curtis had only seen in a few people before. The campaign was evolving beyond what any of them had expected. Soon, Indigo Tower announced a multi-city exhibition titled Unveiled, the Truth Collection, a hybrid of art installation, documentary storytelling, and live performance. The exhibition would feature stories like Elias's, voices that had once been silenced by expectation, violence, or fear, turned into immersive experiences. Each room would represent a personal narrative, brought to life through visuals, soundscapes, physical artifacts, and spoken word. Elias's room would be the centerpiece. Elias didn't want a perfect recreation of his trauma. He didn't want a glossy replication of pain. Instead, he asked for something stark and quiet. The room would be built to resemble the inside of his old apartment, the one he had shared with Lara. Clean, white walls, elegant furniture, carefully curated bookshelves. But behind one of the walls, invisible until someone leaned against it, would be a narrow tunnel lined with mirrors, lit only by soft blue light. The tunnel would force visitors to walk sideways, barely able to move, seeing nothing but fragments of themselves on all sides. The metaphor was deliberate, the space between the facade and the truth. Constriction behind control. When the prototype was built, Elias walked through it alone. The moment he stepped into the mirrored corridor, he stopped breathing for a second. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Every inch of the structure felt like a memory his body had never been able to name. When he emerged on the other side, Curtis was waiting. "You okay?" Curtis asked. Elias nodded, but didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly. "You don't have to keep reliving it," Curtis said gently. "I'm not," Elias answered. "I'm rewriting it." In the lead-up to the opening, demand for tickets exceeded every projection. People flew in from across the country. The first night of the exhibition, the line wrapped around 3 city blocks. News crews gathered outside, influencers filmed slow pans of the building's facade, and security was doubled. Curtis made sure the inside remained calm, reverent, free of flash. This wasn't a party, it was a reckoning. That evening, Elias arrived late on purpose. He didn't want to be part of the opening ceremonies. He slipped in through the service entrance, walked past the catering staff and tech crews, and wandered into the exhibit once the lights had dimmed. He didn't announce himself. He didn't wear a pass. He just watched. Watched people walk through his story. Watched them pause in front of the wedding photo displayed behind glass. Watched them step into the mirrored corridor and stumble. Some walked through silently. Others emerged crying. A few stood outside the room, too afraid to go in. Elias didn't judge them. He understood. He found Curtis near the back of the hall, talking quietly with one of the artists. "People are ready for this," Curtis said when he saw Elias approaching. "I'm not sure I was," Elias replied. "Then you did it right." Elias looked around the space at all the faces he didn't know, moving through his life like it was art, like it mattered. For a long time, he had believed that honesty was a private affair, that truth was best whispered in safe rooms, that survival meant blending in. Now, watching strangers connect over his story, he realized something else. Survival was the first act. This, sharing, exposing, teaching, was the second. That night, Elias went home and found another email from Micah. It read, "I told my mom. She cried, but she didn't throw me out. I think she's trying. Thank you for giving her the chance to try." Elias smiled, not the kind of smile that fades quickly, but the kind that settles slowly, from the inside out. He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the screen, let the words wash over him, and whispered into the darkened apartment, "I'm still here too." Winter crept in quietly, slipping between the buildings of Manhattan like breath on glass, turning the air brittle and thin. The unveiled exhibition was entering its 3rd month, and still the lines wrapped around the block. Elias had started visiting only in the early mornings before the doors opened, when the space was empty and silent. He would walk through the mirrored corridor alone, sometimes stopping in the middle, pressing one palm against the glass and staring at the thousand fragmented versions of himself. The act was no longer painful. It had become something closer to ritual, an acknowledgement of the man he had once been, the man he had shed, and the man he was still learning how to be. Curtis, however, had become a ghost. At first it was subtle. He missed a few early meetings. Then he stopped showing up to evening events altogether. People assumed he was just busy. He was known to vanish for days at a time when working on something new. But Elias noticed the difference. Curtis was no longer staying late in the studio, barefoot and electric with ideas. He was no longer checking in with the team, slipping wry one-liners across the table, challenging people to think harder, go deeper. He wasn't in the cafe in the mornings with his chipped ceramic mug. He wasn't replying to messages with his usual precision. Something had changed, and no one seemed willing to name it. Elias didn't push it first. Their relationship had always thrived in the space between words, in the shared looks and long silences where meaning lived. But after 2 weeks of avoidance, he knocked on the door to Curtis's private suite on the 42nd floor. No answer. The door was unlocked. Elias stepped inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the gray light outside. The air smelled faintly of metal and eucalyptus, the scent of someone who'd been sick and tried to hide it. Curtis was lying on the couch. Not asleep, but not quite awake either, his face pale beneath a growth of stubble, his body thinner than Elias remembered. The laptop beside him was open, screen black. A pile of untouched takeout boxes sat on the table, some beginning to smell. Curtis opened his eyes when Elias entered, but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. "What is it?" Elias asked, his voice quiet, almost reluctant, like someone asking a question they already knew the answer to. Curtis sat up slowly, as though every movement cost him something. He rubbed a hand across his face, then rested his elbows on his knees. "It's called ALS," he said finally. "Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, motor neurons, muscles, you know the rest." Elias did. He had read about it years ago when a professor of his had been diagnosed. The timeline varied, but the outcome was always the same. Progressive, terminal, no cure, no mercy. "How long have you known?" Elias asked. Curtis didn't look at him. 6 months, officially. "I started feeling the tremors last spring, but I ignored them. Too much to do. Too many fires to put out. I thought maybe it was stress. I told myself I'd get checked after the exhibition launched, and then it was too late." "You should have told me," Elias said, sitting down across from him. "I didn't want you to look at me differently." "I wouldn't have." Curtis finally met his eyes. "You're looking at me differently right now." There was no point in denying it. Elias was. He was seeing him not as the untouchable force who had pulled him out of the wreckage of his old life, but as a man who was slowly losing his grip on the physical world, his body, his energy, his control. The realization felt like a betrayal of some unspoken rule. Curtis had been the constant, the unshakable one. The idea that he could vanish felt impossible. Curtis leaned back into the couch cushions. "I didn't want the campaign to become about me, about tragedy. I wanted it to stay about survival, about stepping into life, not out of it." "It still is," Elias said. "And so are you." Curtis closed his eyes briefly, as if the words had landed somewhere deep. "I'm not afraid of dying," he said after a moment. "I'm afraid of leaving before I finish what I started." "You won't," Elias said. "You don't have to." They didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the wind pushing against the windows high above the street. In the weeks that followed, Elias began spending more time in the suite with Curtis. He brought food that Curtis could stomach, helped him with minor tasks, insisted on involving him in decisions even when Curtis resisted. The disease was progressing faster than expected. Some days Curtis could still walk on his own, speak clearly, even joke. Other days his speech was slurred, his hands trembled, and he disappeared behind his own silence. The team at Indigo Tower didn't know the full extent of what was happening. Curtis had insisted on privacy. Only a few senior staff members had been told, and even they weren't permitted to speak of it. Elias carried the weight in quiet ways. He took over Curtis's notes on campaign pitches, reviewed designs in his place, stepped into interviews as his representative. The public didn't notice. They assumed Elias was simply being elevated as the new face of the movement. But behind the scenes, it was grief in slow motion. One evening, Curtis asked Elias to bring him up to the roof. It was snowing lightly, a soft flurry of white brushing across the city. Elias helped Curtis into his coat, then into the elevator, and finally up the final flight of stairs. They stood on the rooftop, wrapped in blankets, Curtis in a chair, Elias standing beside him. Curtis stared out at the skyline. "This city never stops," he said. "You ever notice that? It just keeps moving. Doesn't matter who's watching or who's gone." Elias nodded. "You've built something that will outlive you." Curtis turned to look at him. "So have you." There was a long pause. "I never wanted to fall in love with someone who had a future I wouldn't get to see," Curtis said. "But you walked into that ballroom like a man already halfway on fire, and I couldn't help myself." Elias didn't say anything. He simply sat down beside him and took his hand, holding it like a tether against the night. "I'm sorry," Curtis whispered. "For what?" Elias asked. "For leaving you with everything." "You gave me everything," Elias said. "That's not something you apologize for." Curtis nodded slowly. The snow fell silently around them. The city blinked below. And somewhere deep in the dark sky above them, the world continued turning, unaware of the moment, but made better because it existed. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in late spring, when the streets of New York still felt quiet enough to belong to those who rose early and dared to claim a piece of the city before it fully woke. There were no velvet invitations or ornate rehearsal dinners, no magazine spreads or seating charts curated for influence. There was only a small guest list made up of those who had stood beside them in the most intimate and unmarketable moments of their lives. Rain and Mateo, Delaney from the interview, Micah and their mother, two of Elias's oldest friends from architecture school, and Curtis's sister who flew in from Portland without telling anyone until she showed up at the Indigo Tower front desk carrying a single suitcase and a picture frame with a photo of them as kids. It was not the kind of wedding people expected, especially not from two men whose faces had become so publicly symbolic, whose names now circled in media with words like bravery and legacy and cultural shift. But it was precisely because of that they chose quiet over spectacle. The ceremony was held on the rooftop of the Indigo Tower building, not the public-facing rooftop where the press events were held, but the private upper deck that most people didn't know existed, accessible only by a narrow staircase and a coated panel. It had been Curtis's favorite place in the entire building long before it became his office or his headquarters. He used to call it the breath between floors. When Elias asked him why, Curtis had smiled and said, "Because up here the air feels just a little less choreographed." Curtis was already seated when Elias arrived. He wore a deep gray suit tailored loosely to accommodate the increasing stiffness in his shoulders. His shoes were simple. His hair was still damp from the morning shower, brushed back but unruly at the edges. He looked tired but alert, fragile but proud. Elias walked toward him slowly, not with hesitation but with reverence, as if each step were an answer to every version of himself that once believed this day would never come. There was no music, just the sound of the city rising around them, the distant horn of a ferry on the Hudson, a delivery truck down below, the flutter of pigeon wings overhead. The officiant was not a minister, but Rain, who stood between them with a single sheet of paper and a voice that never needed a microphone to carry. "We're not here for perfection," Rain began, their voice calm and unsentimental. "We're not here to rehearse a fantasy. We're here to witness a promise between two men who have chosen, despite everything, to keep showing up." Elias took Curtis's hand and held it gently. Curtis's fingers were thinner now, weaker but still steady. They looked at each other, and for a moment no one else existed. Elias spoke first. "I've known you in silence and in noise. I've known you at your strongest and at your most human. I didn't fall in love with a headline or a hero. I fell in love with the way you see the world even when it's cruel, with how you show up even when it costs you, with the way you make room for people even when you're running out of room yourself. I don't promise to protect you from the end. I promise to walk with you through it. I promise not to flinch when the hard days come. I promise to remember the sound of your laugh when the rooms grow quiet. I promise to keep building, not as a way to escape the loss, but as a way to honor what we made." Curtis didn't try to wipe the tear that fell down his cheek. He let it be. Then he began to speak, voice quiet but deliberate. "I didn't believe in this. Not just marriage, but the idea that someone could see all of me and not want to leave. I thought I was safest alone. I built towers for a reason. And then you walked in, not with fire, but with patience. You stood still long enough for me to realize I didn't have to run anymore. You never tried to save me. You just stayed. And now I see that staying is a form of saving too. I don't promise a long future, but I promise every part of myself, every breath I have left. I promise to let you love me even when I'm hard to hold. Rain didn't speak for a long moment after the vows ended. They simply looked at the two of them, then at the guests who stood silently with hands clasped and eyes wet. By the truth between you and the love you've dared to claim, Rain said softly, you are now married. No paperwork required, no permission needed. The ceremony ended with no applause, only stillness, only presence. It was exactly what they wanted. Afterward, they held a quiet gathering in the studio downstairs. Matteo made a strange and beautiful wedding cake shaped like an open book. Delaney brought a small speaker and played Nina Simone. Micah read a poem they'd written, their voice shaking but sure. There were no speeches, no first dances, no bouquet tosses. Just soft conversations, real laughter, and Curtis sleeping briefly in Elias's arms on the couch when the exhaustion overtook him. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the lights were dimmed, Elias helped Curtis back up to the rooftop. The wind had picked up, but the sky was clear and full of stars, rare in Manhattan. They sat together wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea from mismatched mugs. I used to think I'd never be seen for who I really was, Curtis murmured. You were always visible, Elias replied. You just needed someone to stay long enough to see past the light. Curtis smiled faintly and leaned his head against Elias's shoulder. Thank you for marrying me, he whispered. Elias kissed the top of his head and whispered back, thank you for letting me. Curtis passed away 5 months after the wedding, in the early hours of a September morning. It was quiet. He had been sleeping in their bed, his breathing shallow but steady, his hands folded across his chest the way they often were when he felt safe. Elias had stayed awake most of the night beside him, reading aloud from a book of poems Curtis once said reminded him of childhood. Small, strange verses about rivers, stars, and silence. The sun hadn't yet risen when Elias realized the rhythm of Curtis's breathing had stopped. There was no gasping, no clinging, no final desperate moment, just stillness, as if the body had finally released its grip on something it had long been preparing to let go. Elias didn't cry right away. He sat there for over an hour, holding Curtis's hand, whispering things he couldn't say before, thanking him, promising things he didn't yet know how to keep. He watched the city wake up beneath the window, watched the light stretch across the skyline, soft and unbothered by loss. The funeral was held privately in an old converted church in the East Village. Curtis had left behind no formal instructions except one line in his journal, written in his distinct angular handwriting. Make it feel like a conversation, not a conclusion. Elias honored that wish. There were no sermons, no flowers arranged in dramatic displays, no suits unless they were worn because someone felt most themselves in one. Instead, there were chairs in a circle, a table in the middle covered with Curtis's favorite books, handwritten notes from friends and strangers alike, and a loop of quiet instrumental music playing in the background. A playlist Curtis had once titled, Mornings I Actually Lived. Each guest spoke if they wanted to. Some told stories. Some simply sat in silence. Some cried. Rain read a letter Curtis had written them a year earlier, after a creative disagreement. It was equal parts ruthless critique and loving praise. Matteo brought a jacket Curtis had helped design years ago, one that was never produced, and laid it over the back of an empty chair. Delaney shared a recording of a voicemail Curtis had left late one night, rambling about a dream in which he tried to teach a workshop in space. Elias didn't speak until the very end, and even then, he didn't prepare anything. He just stood in the center of the room, his hands in his pockets, eyes a little bloodshot but clear. I used to think grief would make me collapse, he said, that if I lost someone I loved, I'd fall apart in a way I couldn't recover from. But that's not what happened. What's strange is that I didn't collapse. I became heavier, like something inside me deepened. Not just sadness, but understanding. I feel like I've been made denser by knowing him, like part of him calcified into my bones. So he's not gone, he's just folded in. He looked around the room. Curtis never asked anyone to be more than they were. He just made space for you to figure out who that might be. And if you're in this room, it's probably because he did that for you too. So let's not mourn him by pretending he was perfect. Let's honor him by continuing what he started. With imperfection, with creativity, with defiance. After the memorial, Elias disappeared for a while. Not in the dramatic vanishing act way people expect from public figures, but in a quieter, more intimate sense. He stopped making appearances. He turned down interviews, declined panels, left social media untouched. He traveled to Maine for a month, staying in a cabin Curtis had once pointed to on a map during a late-night planning session, saying, "If I ever go missing, check there first." Elias walked in the woods each morning, cooked small meals, wrote, without an audience, and reread all of Curtis's old notebooks. He didn't try to be productive. He just tried to be alive. When he returned to New York, something had shifted. He moved out of their suite at Indigo Tower, but kept an office on the 17th floor. He no longer led public campaigns. Instead, he quietly started building something different. The idea came from a single line he found in one of Curtis's journal entries, one he'd never seen before. "I want to create a place where being honest doesn't feel like performing." From that seed, Elias developed a new initiative, one that had nothing to do with branding or fashion or curated storytelling. He named it the Tower of Grace, and it was unlike anything else Indigo Tower had done. The Tower of Grace wasn't a program or a project. It was a living space. A hybrid of shelter, studio, school, and sanctuary designed for LGBTQ+ youth who had been displaced, disowned, or simply lost. It offered therapy, mentorship, creative training, and above all, protection. It didn't demand that its residents produce content or perform recovery. It just gave them the tools to reclaim themselves on their own terms. Some came for a week, some stayed for a year. No one was turned away. Word of the tower spread quietly through networks of teachers, social workers, and community organizers. There were no splashy press releases, no headlines. Elias refused interviews about it. He didn't need the attention. He needed the doors to stay open. On the first anniversary of Curtis's death, Elias returned to the rooftop alone. He brought with him the same chipped ceramic mug Curtis used to drink from, filled it with black coffee, and stood in the same spot where they had once watched snowfall. The city hadn't stopped. The skyline still pulsed. But something in him had quieted, not broken, not empty, just quieter, fuller, like a song that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Later that day, he gave a speech at a private Indigo Tower gathering. No cameras, just the team. People who had known Curtis, who had been shaped by him, who had stayed when things got hard. Elias stood in front of them, holding a single sheet of paper, but never once looking down at it. "I used to think the most important part of a legacy was what you left behind," he said. "But now I understand it's what you leave inside people." Curtis didn't leave us with answers. He left us with questions worth living through. He left us with the courage to tell the truth, even when no one's clapping. He left us with each other. He paused, looked around the room, and added, "And he left me with the belief that even when the story ends, the love doesn't." That night, Elias sat at his desk and opened his email. There was a message from Micah, now 17, now living in Brooklyn, now volunteering 3 days a week at the tower. It read, "You were right. Survival is the first act. But I think I'm finally ready to write the second." Elias replied, "Then let's write it together." And then he closed his laptop, turned off the light, and let the quiet hold him. Not as a shadow of grief, but as proof that what had been built was still standing, still living, still opening its doors.